this English lesson, we'll read a CNN news article together. And as we read the article, you'll learn advanced English vocabulary in context. You'll learn the correct grammar and the correct pronunciation at the same time. This is an advanced article discussing the impact of language on longevity. If you can understand this article, your English is excellent. Welcome back to JForrest English. Of course, I'm Jennifer. Now let's get started. Our headline, Mastery of Language Could Predict Longevity. Do you know what longevity is? Longevity is the concept of living longer, so living longer than average. Now, notice that pronunciation, longevity. So you hear this j sound, even though it is not there in spelling. And that's to help transition between this this G sound, longevity, longevity. Repeat after me, longevity. Used in a sentence, you could say he attributed his longevity. Longevity is a noun and it belongs to him. He attributed his longevity to exercise and a healthy diet. So using attributed is saying that these two things, it could just be one thing, but in this sentence, these two things are responsible for his longevity. So you could say it a different way. I wrote that here for you so you can see the sentence structure, and I use the verb to be responsible, the preposition for. Now, of course, your verb to be has to be conjugated. In this case, we have two items, so it is plural, are. Now, in this headline, mastery of language could predict longevity. So could be responsible for or could cause. But notice this use of the modal verb. Could is just used to say something is possible, but not necessarily guaranteed. So this doesn't mean that mastery of language will predict longevity. That is more definitive. This is simply a possibility. So notice could and then your base verb, could predict. And don't worry about taking notes because I summarize everything in a free lesson PDF and you can find the link in the description. Now let's continue with the article. In a study published earlier this year in Psychological Science, so notice the pronunciation of this, that P is silent. You hear the S, psychological. Now this is an adjective. It describes the science. Psychological science, just like biological science, so it's an adjective. The same pronunciation rule applies to the noun, psychology. This is the area of study, the field. You could say, I studied psychology in school. The same pronunciation also applies to psychologist, which is also a noun, but it's a job title. So you can say, I studied psychology, and now I am a psychologist. This is the job title. In a study published earlier this year in Psychological Science, a team of researchers reported a link between verbal fluency and mortality risk. So we have A and B, two objects. Now the link or a link is a connection. So there's some connection between verbal fluency, the topic of this article, and mortality risk, your risk of dying. Mortality refers to death, so your risk of dying. Let's review this sentence. There's a link, it exists, the link, the connection exists. There's a link between, remember, two things, how much I watch Jennifer's videos and my English level. Now, this is a more formal or academic way of saying this. In everyday casual English, you could say, the more I watch Jennifer's videos, the better my English gets, because there's a link, there's a connection between them. Do you agree with this? Do you think the more I watch Jennifer's videos, the better my English gets? There's a link, a connection. If you do, put that's right, put that's right in the comments. And I certainly hope you do. Let's continue. Between 1990 and 2009,
Investigators assessed the cognitive abilities of more than 500 participants who were 70 years or older when the study began. Okay, so notice how they said 70 years. You could say 70 years, like they did here, or you could say 70 years of age, That's a little more formal sounding, but you will definitely see it. And let's review cognitive abilities. Cognitive refers to how you use your brain. So your ability to learn, to problem solve, to remember, to process information, all of that represents your cognitive abilities. And of course, as we age, our cognitive abilities generally decline.
Are you enjoying this lesson? If you are, then I want to tell you about the Finally Fluent Academy. This is my premium training program where we study native English speakers from TV, movies, YouTube, and the news so you can improve your listening skills of fast English, expand your vocabulary with natural expressions, and learn advanced grammar easily. Plus, you'll have me as your personal coach. You can look in the description for the link to learn more, or you can go to my website and click on Finally Fluent Academy. Now let's continue with our lesson.
All of the study's participants are now deceased. Deceased is a politer way, a more formal way of saying dead. Now notice it's to be, so to be deceased, to be dead, and then you conjugate your verb to be because we have participants, it's plural. Now they're dead because when the study started, they were already 70 years of age or older. So that's the reason why. All of the study's participants are now deceased, and researchers can use the results from the cognitive tests, so from their brain tests, to see if any of the measures are predictive of the participants' lifespans. So the participants' lifespans, you could say, are predictive of longevity. Now, saying are predictive of is another way of saying, can any of these tests predict longevity? So will any of these tests tell us if longevity is more likely or less likely? Now, remember that the concept of longevity means that you live longer than normal or longer than average. But just saying lifespan doesn't suggest that it's longer. So only that word longevity does. So you could say the measures are predictive of the participants' longevity, but that means their ability to live longer than average. Let's continue. Somewhat surprisingly, out of the areas tested, only one was related to decreased mortality: verbal fluency. Now, somewhat surprisingly, so surprisingly means, wow, I didn't expect that to happen, but saying somewhat reduces that. So, I guess I didn't expect that, or yeah, I can see that. So it reduces the surprising element of it. You can use the word somewhat in a more everyday context and say, I was somewhat angry, or whatever emotion it is. I was somewhat angry when she forgot my birthday. So it's just saying a little angry. I was somewhat angry. So very commonly used in an everyday context. Somewhat surprisingly, a little bit surprisingly, out of the areas tested, only one was related to decreased mortality, so reducing the risk of death: verbal fluency. So there's a connection, a link between verbal fluency and mortality risk. Specifically, the researchers found an almost 9-year predicted difference in median survival time between the study participants with high versus low values on verbal fluency. This might sound a little complicated. Let's make it easy to understand. In median survival time, and then 9-year difference. Okay, so median means average. So let's say there's an average survival time, how long someone lives, and it's 9 years higher for people with high verbal fluency. So they did studies, and if you scored high on verbal fluency tests, it was predicted, so people thought that you could live 9 years longer than someone who scored lower on verbal fluency tests. The use of that word predicted is important because they're saying it isn't guaranteed. It's simply a prediction. We think this will happen. This is a more academic way of describing it because this is in a research study, an academic research study. In everyday English, I would simply say the researchers found that people in the study with better verbal skills or higher verbal fluency were predicted to live almost 9 years longer than those, so than represents compared to those with lower verbal skills, or in this case, verbal fluency, but you can think of it simply as verbal skills. That's a more everyday way of understanding it. Now, the next part describes what verbal fluency is, because honestly, until I read this article, I didn't quite know what they meant by verbal fluency. So notice this: simply put. This is a great introduction phrase, and it means to say it simply. So to define it in simple words or simple terms, you can use these two. Simply put. Instead of put, you could say simply said. Simply put, simply said. Now, it's also quite common to use to say it simply, to put it simply. So you can still use these two verbs, say or put. We'll use this one. Simply put, verbal fluency refers to how quickly people can produce words when asked to provide terms that match specific criteria. Now, keep in mind, they're not talking about fluency in a foreign language. They're talking about fluency in one's native language in the context of this study. And criteria refers to standards or rules that people need to follow or meet. So all the skills and experience or requirements in a job posting, you could refer to that as the criteria. For example, she met most of the criteria. So notice you can meet the criteria if it's required that you have skills. If you are following a procedure, then you can use the verb follow for directions or step by step. She met the past simple of meet. She met most of the criteria for the job. So let's schedule an interview. Let's continue here. One of these was categories. So one of the criteria of verbal fluency was categories. And this involved, so they're letting us know what this means. And this involved naming as many animals as they could think of in 90 seconds, such as elephant, lion, monkey, and so forth. So, and so forth, you could also say and so on to say these three plus any other animal. So, and so forth, and so on. And remember, this is in one's native language. So this could be a fun game you play with your friends. Set a timer for 90 seconds and ask the friend how many animals they can name. And you can do this in English after, just for a fun exercise. The second measure, so we could say the second criteria, the first criteria was naming animals. The second criteria or measure was word beginnings. In this task, participants were urged to produce as many words as they could think of starting with the letter S, such as see, shepherd, or surely. So notice, such as, these are the examples. You could say, for example, such as. Now this one just ended. They didn't say and so forth, but you could also just do comma, and so forth, and so on. And notice they both started with such as, for example. And again, this was in 90 seconds. Ooh, so this could be another fun game you play, and you can do all letters of the alphabet as well. And again, in your native language and in English. That would be a fun challenge. Let's talk about this verb, urged. Notice that pronunciation, urged, because this ED is pronounced as a soft D. urged. And it really sounds like just an sound. Urged. So the verb is to urge, and you urge someone to do something, and that means you strongly encourage them. I could say, I urged my students to like this video and leave a nice comment. I strongly encouraged my students. So I'll do that right now. Please, if you are finding this valuable, like this video and leave a nice comment, because it's the only way that I'm able to keep producing these lessons for free. So that is an example of how I urged you. I strongly encouraged you. And that wasn't just an example. Please do this right now. What do you notice about this sentence structure? Participants were urged to produce as many new words as possible, or as they could think of. Now, in this case, it's the passive form because it's talking about the participants receiving the urge. In my sentence, which was active, I was giving the urge. So I'm doing the action. In the passive voice, to change this sentence, I would start with, in this case, the object, the students, to be urged in the past simple, were urged because it's plural, were urged to like the video and leave a nice comment. Now, you don't have to include who is doing the action, who is urging, but if you were to include it, you would say by Jennifer. The students were urged. Again, now you have two fun games you can play in your native language and in English as well. Let's continue. This echoes a previous study. Okay, so this echoes a previous study. Notice that this is a verb here, to echo. But what does this mean? This echoes a previous study. Well, what is an echo? Echo, echo, echo. If you're in a cave and you say, hello, 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 it says it again, right? So to echo something is to say the same thing. So to repeat. So this study repeats a previous study. It confirms the findings or confirms the information. Thinking of the definition of this verb to echo and what an echo, hello, hello, hello is, let's review this sentence. Learning English with the news is an awesome method. Do you agree with this statement? If you do, you can simply say, I agree, or you can say, I echo that, because again, echo, echo. So you're saying the same thing. I echo that. It's also very common to say, I second that. I second that, to mean the same thing. I repeat what you just said. So now you have two other ways to say, I agree. This echoes a previous study where researchers found an association. What else can you say? We learned it before. A link or a connection. So researchers found an association, a link, a connection, and then again, between A and B. In this case, between reading and longevity. So reading and your ability to live longer than average. So that was a different study. Remember, this study is about verbal fluency and longevity, but this study on verbal fluency and longevity echoes, confirms, or supports a previous study on reading and longevity. And in both studies, there's a link, a connection, an association between the two. In this study, so now this means this is always the last thing identified. So now this represents the study on reading and longevity, which is not the study we are talking about. So in this study on reading and longevity, researchers found that reading for an average of just 30 minutes a day, what's the length of this video? About 30 minutes, but you're not reading, you're more listening, but you're reading as well. So reading for an average of just 30 minutes a day was sufficient. Sufficient means enough, enough. It's more formal sounding. For example, 3 years of experience is sufficient. is enough to meet the criteria. Remember, you meet, the verb meet a criteria, to meet the criteria. So this could be for a job posting, and the the requirement is 3 years of experience. So reading just 30 minutes a day was sufficient enough for the activity to be associated with a survival advantage. This with a survival advantage, it sounds like a very technical way of saying with longevity. Remember, longevity is your ability to live longer. So with longevity or with living longer, you could specifically say that. Or with a longer lifespan, because just the word lifespan doesn't mean long. It's neutral. So you would have to say with a longer lifespan. But remember, the word longevity includes longer life in it. And here we have our word associated, but notice here, an association, this is the noun form, a link, a connection, an association. All of these are nouns. So let me write that for you. These are nouns. Now, this to be associated with, associated functions as the adjective form. So because of that, the verb to be, this is the verb, and then this is the past participle functioning as the adjective. So I could use linked, connected, because those would be the adjective past participle forms, but I can't use with. I would say to be linked, to be connected. So I would use this same to be, and then I would use the ed form with linked, connected. But notice to something, to longevity. Now, if I were to use a verb such as living longer, I would use the gerund verb because to is the preposition that belongs with the expression. It doesn't belong to the word living. It's not the infinitive. It belongs to the expression, so it functions as a preposition, and you use the ing verb after prepositions. That's also why I have living here in the ing form, because the preposition in this case is with. So just remember to be associated with something, but if you want to use linked or connected, it has the same meaning, but you use the preposition to something. Let's continue. An important caveat. Okay, do you know what a caveat is? A caveat is a warning or a cautionary note. So they just said that there's a link, a connection between reading for 30 minutes a day and longevity. But there's a cautionary note. There's some words of caution that I need to say about this point. That's the caveat. There's a warning or a limitation about what I just said. So let's review caveat, a warning or words of limitation or caution in this example. Learning English with the news can help you improve your fluency. That's true, but there's one caveat. So you can say there's one caveat, there's a caveat, there's an important caveat, and then you list it. What's the limitation? What's the warning? You need to practice everything you learn multiple times. So you need to take this lesson, watch it again, download the free lesson PDF, review all the vocabulary, write practice exercises, say it out loud, do that multiple times. That's the caveat. So what's the caveat in this study? An important caveat, however, is that the strongest association in this study was found for participants who predominantly read books as opposed to newspapers, oh no, and magazines, oh no. But remember, I'm not claiming that learning English with the news will help you live longer. That's what this is saying. I'm claiming it will help you improve your fluency. This study is about living longer. So apparently, reading 30 minutes a day, if it's the news or magazines, it isn't associated with longevity. It isn't linked to or connected to longevity. That's the caveat here. But again, my sentence to you was about improving your fluency. And who knows, maybe it will also help you live longer. And that is the end of the article. So what I'll do now is I'll read the article from start to finish, and you can focus on my pronunciation. Mastery of language could predict longevity. In a study published earlier this year in Psychological Science, a team of researchers reported a link between verbal fluency and mortality risk. Between 1990 and 2009, investigators assessed the cognitive abilities of more than 500 participants who were 70 years or older when the study began. All of the study's participants are now deceased, and researchers can use the results from the cognitive tests to see if any of the measures are predictive of the participants' lifespans. Somewhat surprisingly, out of the areas tested, only one was related to decreased mortality: verbal fluency. Specifically, the researchers found an almost 9-year predicted difference in median survival time between the study participants with high versus low values on verbal fluency. Simply put, verbal fluency refers to how quickly people can produce words when asked to provide terms that match specific criteria. One of these was categories, and this involved naming as many animals as they could think of in 90 seconds, such as elephant, lion, monkey, and so forth. The second measure was word beginnings. In this task, participants were urged to produce as many words as they could think of, starting with the letter S, such as see, shepherd, or Shirley, in 90 seconds. This echoes a previous study where researchers found an association between reading and longevity. In this study, researchers found that reading for an average of just 30 minutes a day was sufficient for the activity to be associated with a survival advantage. An important caveat, however, is that the strongest association in this study was found for participants who predominantly read books as opposed to newspapers and magazines.
Do you want to keep learning English with the news? If you do, put let's go, put let's go in the comments. And of course, make sure you like this lesson, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you're notified every time I post a new lesson. And you can get this free speaking guide where I share 6 tips on how to speak English fluently and confidently. You can click here to download it or look for the link in the description. And here's another lesson I know you'll love. Watch it now.